From the newsroom of Impact Alpha, I'm Brian Walsh, and this is your Impact Briefing for Friday, November 12th. I'm back from Glasgow, and I'm joined by our roundtable regulars to sort out what was accomplished and what was not, and to find out what the latest inflation numbers mean for Impact investors. Imogen Rose Smith is an Impact Alpha contributing editor. Hi, Imogen.
Hi, Brian. Good to have you back.
And David Bank is Impact Alpha's editor and CEO. Hi, David.
Hey, great to see both of you.
But first, here's what you need to know from this week in Impact Investing. Negotiators are pushing the deadlines as COP26 comes to a close. Among the late-breaking issues are rules for a global carbon market, so-called Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement. The goal is to make carbon offsets and allowances tradable across geographies, also drive financing for climate mitigation projects, and set a de facto global price on carbon. Technology is disrupting the business of lending to small businesses in emerging markets. There's something like a $5 trillion financing gap for such businesses worldwide. Development finance institutions and commercial banks have viewed small business lending as risky and expensive. So now stepping into the breach are enterprise tech providers, fintech startups, and even cryptocurrency platforms. Join Impact Alpha's Agents of Impact Call number 34 on Tuesday, November 16th to learn more. And speaking of small businesses, they contribute up to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in advanced economies. But fewer than 1 in 10 can actually measure those emissions. In a guest post, Proof of Impact's Evan Vahuni offers 4 tips that can help small businesses manage their own emissions. Fusion power is so hot right now. Helion Energy raked in a $500 million investment, the largest ever investment for a private fusion venture. Other venture-backed startups, including Commonwealth Fusion and TAE Technologies, are raising war chests to commercialize fusion power. Expectations are rising that the clean energy game changer might be just around the corner, for real this time. In deal news this week, the startup Inspiration secured $200 million from ArcLight to help commercial vehicle fleets go electric. Evergreen Coast took a majority stake in the edtech startup Dreambox. TPG's Rise Fund had invested $130 million in Dreambox back in 2018, and they'll retain a minority stake in the company. And finally, Novata, a new platform to help private companies collect and benchmark environmental, social, and governance data, raised $21 million from the Ford Foundation, Omidyar Network, S&P Global, Hamilton Lane, and several other private equity firms. As a reminder, Ford and Omidyar are sponsors of Impact Alpha. Impact Alpha subscribers got all of these stories and more in their email inboxes each day this week. Now it's time for our featured conversation. This week's inflation report in the U.S. and rising oil prices around the world are challenging sustainable investors. For starters, divestment from fossil fuels has become a harder sell, while asset inflation has the greatest negative impact on the most vulnerable populations. The need for impact solutions has never been greater, but the new landscape raises a slew of ethical and economic concerns. Imogen, your institutional impact column this week touched on these issues. Can you tell us more?
I can, but before I do so, we want to hear more about Glasgow and your experience at COP. How was it?
Glasgow was amazing. It was a beautiful city. I wasn't one of the fancy people in the blue zone, which is where all the diplomats and negotiators and official observers were. But there was plenty of energy and excitement and meetings to be had in the green zone and other areas around the city. And as I've been saying to folks, Glasgow was full of both your Gretas and your Marks. Those people working within the system and those working without the system. So your Gretas are a reference to Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish climate activist who is trying to agitate from outside the system, urging even more drastic action and more urgent action by the world leaders. And her catchphrase of world leaders only offering blah, blah, blah was plastered throughout the city. And the Marks, represented by Mark Carney, the former central banker, who unveiled a very strong commitment from asset managers representing nearly $130 trillion in assets under management to be aligned to net zero goals by the year 2050. So you have your Gretas working outside the system, your Marks working within the system, and they're all there with a shared goal of how do we avoid the worst of climate change and how do we keep global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But I think the third party that's even more crucial weren't there. You didn't have your Xis, your Vladimirs. You didn't have so many other actors who are kind of critical to achieving global solutions to the climate crisis and the climate emergency. And so I think there is a lot of reasons for hope and optimism out of COP, but also a lot of reasons for serious kind of reflection on how do we actually make more meaningful progress moving forward.
I know this was your first time on the ground at COP, but did it feel worth it? Like, did it feel like there was sort of a material difference and real change happening, or did it just feel like, a big junket and a lot of blah, blah, blah?
I mean, you could certainly make a case that there's junket-like aspects to it, and you can certainly make a case that there's a lot of blah blah blah. But I think that's a too cynical case to be made, and for my taste, because I think you'd have to take it from the kind of counterfactual. What happens if there were no COP? Right? What happens if you didn't have so many countries and so many different constituencies coming together to try to address these big issues? And I think that would be an even worse situation. That famous line that democracy is the worst form of government except for every other. It's kind of like COP is the worst kind of climate conference gathering that we could have except for every other.
Brian, one of the rays of hope or supposed positives in this COP was the increased focus on private finance, but I don't know whether that's a glass half full, glass half empty thing as well. I mean, there are many folks saying, "Hey, the money's committed on forests, some of the methane stuff, maybe even this carbon markets that you mentioned in the headlines. That there's some momentum on the private side. Does on the other hand, maybe they can't even come up with $100 billion for emerging market climate adaptation and mitigation. So where did you land on the private finance spectrum?
Yeah, I do think that the private finance seemed to me, from my vantage point, a key emphasis and a key focus of this COP. And I think that there is a lot of reason for hope and optimism around that, but that can't be a substitute for the more serious and critical government action that needs to happen as far as government funding, direct funding from especially wealthy countries to help less wealthy countries adapt and be resilient in the face of climate change, but also government regulations. And I think ultimately, we need things like a true regulation and a price on carbon and other pieces like that. So I think that there's a lot of reason to be excited about the serious financial actors who have come into the conversation, are taking this seriously, and want to play their part. But again, just from my own personal vantage point, that can't be any kind of substitute for the type of action and regulation that can only come from governments.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, to me, to a certain extent, the sort of the focus on the private sector climate finance is, a bit of, pun intended, a cop out, right? Like, it's what we do when we know governments aren't able to step up. And I think that, I'm skeptical. I'm much less excited about Mark Carney's big announcement than you are. I'm skeptical that the pledges are really going to result in real dollars. And we know that, like, the markets will act when regulators do so. But, like, relying on the private sector to do the responsible thing is, stupid.
I think that I mean, at least some faction, and I wouldn't say even it's the majority faction, but at least a significant minority faction in both the corporate world and the finance world is eager to get on with this. And as you say, they're waiting for the leadership from the governmental public side to just give them the sort of starting gun to really jump in, with both feet, because there's things that they know they need to do for their own businesses and their own futures, but they can't really do it on their own, whether it's competitive pressure or what have you. But they're not opposed to being told by government that this is the new direction for the
Well, part of it,
world
though, is
economy.
also, right, like on the infrastructure side in particular, it's like if some of this development is going to get subsidized by government, the private sector is incentivized to sit around and sort of twiddle its thumbs until that government subsidy comes in, and then it can provide the next layer of capital, right? So, and you're going to see that, we'll see that with the infrastructure bill in the US, however that shakes out, right? Like investment managers in particular don't want to get ahead of government if there's like easy money to be made down the road.
I'm an example of that because I just bought my first e-bike, my first electric bike, but I realized after the fact that I should have waited for the U.S. spending bills to pass and become law, because there'll be a big subsidy for e-bikes in the U.S. legislation. And so, just to Imogen's point, I should have I got ahead of government policy there, and to my disadvantage.
So you were too early to the e-bike trade.
Exactly.
Right. Well, consumers, just like investors, do respond to incentives. And so if governments can put in place the right incentives, they can create the right kind of behavior, both from investors and from consumers. And I think the other side of this, I was at, I went to one of the protests and the marches, and I ended up going to a table that was staffed by some socialists from the International Socialist Alternative, and I got this flyer for them, and they were advertising their upcoming march, saying, "Fight for socialist change. Capitalism is killing the planet." And this has an image of flames on top of the world. And I think that that's the other piece of this, is that I do think that there is some enlightened self-interest among some of the private capital folks that if they don't take more serious action on this, then the governments will perhaps change around them and not be as friendly to the capitalist class as they might like.
Wow, you're going all in on the revolution.
No, I am all in for the transition that we need to inclusive and low carbon economy, and one that works for people in the global South as well as for people in the global North.
But I think that is one of the inherent tensions that the environmental movement has had, right? That its origins in large part come out of sort of an anti-capitalism, anti-globalism place. And now it is confronted by this reality that the only way we get what we need to get is through capital investment. So that there are parts of the environmental movement, and to be clear, capitalism does terrible things, and it's not just on the environmental side. It's like, what it does in human rights is, often arguably worse, right? So there are true and valid reasons for these protests and for these objections that for all the fuzzy furry rhetoric are not going away, but it makes the dialogue between the environmental movements and the capitalists and the technocrats, who sort of have their hands on the levers and are the ones who have to get us there, very strained in some regards, and in some ways means that the solutions that the sort of more extreme ends of the environmental movement bring to the table often are not very helpful from a finance and investment perspective, and in some ways sort of are negative, right? And you sort of end up in this kind of nihilistic feedback loop. I'm less in for the revolution. I didn't get the poster.
But what does that have to do with inflation, Imogen?
Inflation is going to make things worse. It's going to, inflation is going to, inflation complicates what was already and is already a complex process. It means, for example, if we think about inflation in a very basic sense, when we're talking about the environment and fossil fuels and commodities, right? It was relatively easy to make the argument to divest from fossil fuels over the last decade, because we've seen low prices for coal, oil, and natural gas, right? And there was there seemed to be an alignment between the stranded asset thesis and this idea that these companies weren't doing very well, that the fossil fuel companies weren't doing very well, and that this whole sort of sector was shrinking. But of course, fossil fuel companies are still highly correlated to to the price of commodities, specifically oil and natural gas. And so now that these prices are rising, Exxon's up like 100% on the year or something, right? Like, it's much harder to make the divestment case for these companies, even at a moment when, COP26 is making clear that we need to transition away from fossil fuels, even at a moment when we're talking about financing the clean energy transition. Suddenly the energy market, people are like, coal is rising, so these markets that looked unappealing are no longer are attractive, not because of anything really to do with climate change, but because of more short-term macro trends.
Can I ask a naive question, you guys, which is why when oil prices go up and even coal prices go up and natural gas prices go up, isn't the hue and cry that this is such a injustice to the world's poor to be soaking them for higher energy costs, and everybody should get off of oil because it's obviously a retrogressive force in the world when solar power is getting cheaper and cheaper?
Yeah, because I, as an investor, don't like losing money, right? Like, I might, like, how far and this is sort of why with sort of modern portfolio theory people hate ESG, right? Like, if we take this to its logical conclusion, I'm not going to be able to invest in anything because of the negative impacts that it's going to have. So most investors are not willing to make an ethical argument. They're only willing to make a financial argument. So you have to be able to say, well, hurting the poor over the long term is going to be bad for sustainability, so don't do that. And that's not true for short-term commodity prices. And it's not true for the way that most investors invest. And the problem ends up being, well, then you lag the benchmark and then you have problems with compounding. So they're more worried about losing money and getting behind than they are making money and getting ahead.
So it really had nothing to do with the price, the sort of cost curve of the technology solutions to the climate problem or the energy problem. It had to do with just returns, pure returns for investors. Is that?
Yeah, and it's not just pure returns in some ways. It's more portfolio construction, right? It's like how we put investment portfolios together, and the concern about underperforming during, for example, a rising interest rate environment. But you bring up a good point, which is that what is different this time from, say, 2008, which was the last time we had meaningful inflation, is that there are a lot more options out there for investors, and there's a lot more technology. Tesla only went public in 2010, and you could buy it for $4 a share, right? Like the electric vehicle.
I wish I had.
Yeah, you and me both. I was thinking that Tesla was overpriced at 2019 at $40 a share, so that went badly for me. That there are a lot more investment options out there today for the sort of E in ESG investing. It's not purely a case, and even like, it's not just equities, right? Carbon credits, like European carbon credits, are like through the roof. There are other investment opportunities that you can have. It's not just, oh, should you be buying oil, or, oh, should you be buying fossil fuel companies? And if you believe the technology revolution is going to be sort of more intense, sort of from a returns perspective, than inflation, then you arguably could sort of position a portfolio to ride it out. So it's not, like I'm saying, it's not one-dimensional. It's not either or. It creates a much more complex landscape, and that's true as well on the impact side in terms of rising assets, right? So if you're an impact investor and you're invested in natural resources, that's great, and you're going to be able to profit from that. But at the same time, the price of goods and services are going up, and that price is going to more negatively impact, the poorest and most vulnerable in most communities.
There's kind of this canard going around. I assume it's a canard. You tell me whether I'm right or not. That somehow ESG and impact is causing this inflationary trend, when in fact, many of these things, as we've said, whether it's solar or whatnot, and sort of technology-enabled solutions, are actually making things much cheaper.
Yeah, that Steve Schwartzman said that ESG is causing the price of oil to go up because people aren't lending, and that this is going to result in mass social disruption, as opposed to paying taxes and income inequality. So yeah, there are, and you can see, look, there are arguments that say, well, in order for people to have to green their supply chain, they're going to have to pay more, and that's going to result in toilet paper being more expensive. But at the same time, we've seen countless examples of where one of the reasons private equity is so like rah-rah about ESG is that they see it as a way to save, a cost savings, right? So if you switch to renewables, then you're using less energy. So I think it's sort of unfair and mean-spirited to lay inflation at the feet of ESG and impact. I think there are discussions worth having within that, but over the long term, like this is these are just markets, and ESG investors are just investors, and everyone has to learn how to sort of play with the hand you've got.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much, Imogen Rose Smith.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, David.
And thank you, David.
Thank you both.
That's going to do it for your Impact Briefing this week. More all day, every day at impactalpha.com. Subscribe to get full access to the site and the daily brief. Podcast listeners get $100 off their first year subscription. Go to impactalpha.com/subscribe and use the code BRIEFING100. Thanks for listening, and thanks to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. I'm Brian Walsh, head of sustainability for the capital markets firm TP ICAP. Until next time, take good care.